Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, is a term you've probably heard quite a bit.
DEI.
DEI.
And DEI.
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 DEI is representation. It's the number of people that you have in the organization that mirror the labor force availability.
The police killing of George Floyd and subsequent protests became a tipping point for companies across America. Fortune 1000 companies publicly acknowledged the importance of racial diversity, pledging $340 billion to promote change. But that is starting to change. The commitment to DEI appears to be wavering.
Squawk, Deere is pulling back from DEI measures.
Technology companies made big cuts to those DEI programs.
Lowe's is the latest company to roll back DEI efforts.
I'm not surprised by this. I think as somebody who works in a corporate setting, I don't know if DEI was ever actually properly invested in. I think this is something that, if anything, it feels like it's like a distraction for most of these companies. I know a lot of them have put in, they've either put in donations or maybe they hired some new folks. But at least at most of the companies that I've worked at and most of the people I've interacted with, usually they just hire these figurehead individuals. They say that they care about DEI, but they don't do anything about it. I've never actually seen impactful change. And by impactful change, I mean, I haven't seen the diversity of the companies that I work at change based off of specific DEI initiatives. They generally just follow whatever they were before. There's usually more trainings. People will talk about it. Maybe they'll do some surveys and kind of highlight some random stats. But at the end of the day, I haven't actually seen anyone make any differences. So for me, it's not surprising that they're quiet quitting, in so much as most of the companies that I saw, it was a half-hearted measure to begin with, in so much as I don't know if those companies actually believed in it. Again, because if you take a step back and ask yourself, what company would be in a situation where they don't particularly have diversity? It'd be a company that either is led by people who don't care or are willfully trying to exclude those folks, one way or the other. It's either by intention or by ignorance, potentially. And this is where that's probably going to continue. If you didn't think it was important to have diverse members of your team 3-4 years ago, you probably don't think it's important today. And so that's where, if you thought it was important 4 years ago, it probably still is important to you today. So I don't want to highlight that nobody is following these things, but most of these felt like half-hearted measures. They throw a lot of money around it. They make some big announcements. They do a lot of hype and advertising around it. But then push comes to shove. Are you seeing more people of particular minorities in your company when you didn't see them before? Probably not. This, to me, isn't surprising at all. I think, from my personal perspective, they started quitting DEI the week after they made the donation and said, all right, mission accomplished, we did it, high fives, and went back to business as usual.
Major players have pulled back their initiatives amid growing conservative pressures, uncertain economic conditions, and a politicization of the practice.
Harley joins Tractor Supply Company and Polaris in scaling back or changing DEI policies following a campaign by activist Robbie Starbuck.
Well, there's a new player in the marketplace, and that is the conservative consumer who has woken up to the fact that many companies have divorced from the idea that customers are king.
But DEI advocates argue that this retreat may be overstated. Is it the normal ebb and flow of social initiatives, or is there a shift in corporate culture?
DEI is diversity, is representation. It's the number of people that you have in the organization that mirror the labor force availability.
When we're challenged with growth opportunities, we're often told to think bigger. You've got to think bigger. Well, you in and of yourself and your existing team in your existing structure can't think bigger without new perspectives. And that's what leading bigger is widening your perspective by including others.
Despite challenges, a 2024 study found 75% of U.S. executives highly prioritize DEI, and those executives are being more vocal about their support. In a letter to shareholders, JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon said that the initiatives are driving inclusivity, innovation, and stronger financial performance.
Yeah. That doesn't, so them highlighting the fact that founders or high level executives would be saying that this is a high priority from them is obvious. Obviously, they're going to say that. Like, you're going to, like, if you talk to a manager or some executive and you ask them, how important is it that your employees are treated fairly? They're going to say, it's the most important. It's my top priority. But all of us have worked for companies. We know that's maybe like a second or third priority at best, in most cases, and that might be generous in a number of scenarios. And so, obviously, if you're going to ask somebody to self-report whether or not they care about something, and it's something that they should obviously be caring about, then they're going to say yes. That survey seemed completely useless in my mind, in so much as like what would have been useful to me would have been, how diverse are those companies? What is the actual change that's happening here? If you're just going to ask people whether they care about something that they should obviously care about, they're going to say yes. And if you're just going to take their claims as like, we succeeded, then at face value, then there isn't much actual investigation going on here. But yeah, this has been something that I've personally found disappointing. I know I've pushed for initiatives like this at a variety of companies, and people always agree. People will say, yeah, that's such a good idea. Thank you for bringing that up. We're going to start doing things differently now, and nothing changes. But maybe I'm cynical about this topic, but yeah, it just seems obvious that if you're going to ask somebody if they care about this, they're going to say yes. That seems like a silly survey.
And MasterCard's chief administrative officer acknowledged the company's continued commitment to equality and fairness. Diversity among CEOs is also improving, with more women, Black, Asian, and Latino people occupying the position since 2019.
Over 70.
I just want to go back to that chart because they went through that very quickly. So some of these have changed a bit. So Hispanic and Latino folks barely have moved at all, going from 6.2 to 6.3%. Asians seem to have gone up a good chunk, probably the best proportionally, from 5.8 to 7.3. Black went up quite a bit from 4.1 to 5.2. Obviously, white went down, presumably white male, in this segment, since women is mentioned separately. And women went up from 27.6 to 30.6. So obviously, like, as a whole, women have definitely been taking the lion's share of that. Obviously, if you're looking at the white segment here, it's only dropped 3%. And so that 3% has basically been taken up by the three races highlighted here. But it seems like women are getting more opportunities here. And so this, to me, isn't really claiming victory in any way. And also curious how this is going to turn out in like another 4 or 5 years, because I've seen in some companies they will hire somebody of color, some token individual to show that like they are doing things differently. And again, I think this is going to be related to that like quiet quitting segment of, will those people actually be there in a few years? Because at least from what I've seen from a variety of companies, sometimes they hire these token individuals and then they don't actually give them real authority or power. They're just there as like a figurehead. But it is nice to see that there is actually some portion of employment change for chief executives. So that's good to see. But I've also seen some companies where they'll basically say like, all right, we have a new chief of diversity or equity or an inclusion, and then just hire somebody of color or a minority or a female or combination of those things into that position. So like that alone could be the difference here. This doesn't necessarily mean that they replaced existing executives.
More women, Black, Asian, and Latino people occupying the position since 2019.
Over 70% of leaders choose proteges that are of the same race and gender. We like comfortable, we gravitate to comfortable, but what we have to realize in today's world and tomorrow's future, Comfort means stagnation. It means a lack of change, a lack of forward movement.
So if you look around the room and everybody who's sitting there is a white male, and you're trying to sell products to a multiracial world marketplace, and you don't have anybody who represents that thinking, then you're probably not going to do very well in the marketplace.
DEI advocates point to several benefits, including improved innovation, recruitment, and company reputation.
We say we don't want to have people figure out how they fit in. We want to help people figure out how they stand out.
In 2023, more than 75% of companies in the S&P 500 use DEI metrics in the pay of CEOs and other C-suite executives. Still,
So I'm not sure what they mean by they use DEI metrics in the pay of executives. Maybe that meant like whether they were progressing well in DEI that it progressed. But again, they just said used as a metric, which doesn't necessarily mean their salaries were negatively impacted or positively impacted by these things. They did have a very good point earlier that I want to touch on a little bit more. So they highlighted the fact that like 70% of individuals basically choose somebody of the same like race and gender as them. And I think that's a key point that I think sometimes gets lost in some of these conversations, where obviously a good portion of high level individuals with a lot of wealth, etc., are white men in America. That's obviously true. They've been in America the longest, historically speaking. They've had power the longest, and so they would obviously be the ones who, if they follow this trend, would then hire other people who look like them, and that would kind of perpetuate that dynamic going forward. But with that said, the same thing happens with other folks. So if you're a Hispanic woman, you're probably going to pick a Hispanic woman over anybody else also. And so this is just a thing that is common. This is within human nature. And I think this is an aspect that I don't hear about as much, which is these problems exist because we are human. And they aren't necessarily in a bad connotation. And I think that's where a lot of the conversations that I often have around these topics usually lead to some type of polarization or extremism, where it's referenced as like somebody trying to tear down another individual, and that's almost never the case. It's just from people not thinking too deeply about topics and just doing things that they like to do. And really what ends up happening is that if you think about yourself as an individual, you probably have more friends and family members, certainly, who are of a similar race and or gender to you. Those probably make up the majority of your close circle, and you get along with those people better. Same thing happens in a work environment. You're going to gravitate towards those people there as well. You're going to get along with those people. And what happens when you like an individual? What happens when you're friends with an individual? You want to help that person. And so I'm sure most of us have done this at some point in our lives where, maybe there's a job opening or there's an opportunity for somebody, and the first person that comes to mind is a friend that you have that is potentially struggling or needs a break or could use an opportunity at that point in time. You aren't necessarily thinking, who is the most qualified individual that I know of? Your gut reaction is probably, who do I know that I enjoy interacting with, that I like working with, that I like as another individual, that I respect and get along with, who could use this opportunity? And that's probably just through statistics going to be somebody that's more similar to you. And that's, at least from my perspective, how this happens so often, is that this exact thing is occurring just at scale over and over and over again. And so it's not that I want to believe, at least, that in most cases, it's not somebody being intentionally choosing not to hire somebody of a particular race or gender. It's somebody who's just not thinking too much about it and just trying to do the best for people that they care about. And those are probably going to be people that are similar to them in nature. And this is something that I think needs more thought in general, because a lot of the times that this is brought up, it's just kind of seen as like a white male thing. And this same phenomenon happens in other scenarios as well. So like if you have a CEO, for instance, or a company that's led by women, most of the other leaders are going to be women. In fact, this exact dynamic has been found to be true there, where if you're a male in a company where it's predominantly female leadership, it's going to be harder for you to find opportunities and for you to progress in your career there compared to a woman. And so this is something that we all do, and regardless of race or gender, it's just something that we all naturally do. It's just like an inherent bias that we have, which is we give preferential treatment to people we like, and we tend to like people who are more similar to us. And I don't think it's anything malicious, but I do think it takes intentionality, because I think in a variety of my conversations that I have about this, sometimes they can go and lead towards, oh, it's just like a white male thing, and so therefore you just need to make sure that it's not a white male individual who's in charge, but the same thing would happen if it was a non-white male individual. And while I hope it doesn't matter for this conversation, though I find it often does, I'm actually a non-visible minority. I'm actually half Latino, and so it's not something that you might have guessed necessarily from seeing me right now or speaking, but that's what happens for a variety of individuals. They could have a mix of races. They could be visibly distinct from somebody else or not. I think that happens a lot for instance, like gender or sexual orientation or your belief system or religion. These are things that aren't always visible to other individuals. And those things are all true as well. If you have somebody of the same belief system or same religion as you, you're probably going to be more likely to enjoy interacting with that person and give that person benefits. And again, I think this is where it really should be trying to find ways of how do you get the most qualified people into the job at that point in time, because I think that's really what's going to be best for the peers of this individual and also for the company overall. And that's my belief, is that you should be putting in effort to ensure high quality individuals are getting that job, and try to see if whatever mechanisms you have to assess that are biased one way or the other, and adjust if they are where appropriate. And again, I think some people come to this conversation very polarized, but I do believe that we should be doing more of it. I think being in a tech background, like there's barely any folks that are Black or Latino that I interact with. Like in many companies, sometimes I'm the only one of anything slightly resembling Latino that I work with out of like dozens of individuals sometimes. And that's a shame, in my opinion. I hope that there's more. And it's also challenging from the other side as being a manager. I know myself, I try to put in a lot of effort to try to find these individuals, but this is something where it is somewhat a self-propagating issue, where if you want to hire a senior individual of a particular background or want to help incentivize those individuals, they could be harder to find because maybe they didn't have the opportunities leading up to that point. And that makes this especially hard from my perspective in like a STEM field, where women are less likely to enter into the field as well as minorities. And so there's just not as many in the applicant pool, and they're likely getting the worst treatment at like the entry level, where things are very hard to kind of get set up. But I think once they have experience and once they do things, generally I do think that they get a relatively fair opportunity. Most companies that I see really care about number of years of experience. And if you can do your job well, that's good. But if you're like one of tens of thousands of people applying for a job at an entry level position with no experience, likely those biases are going to start to amplify. And if there's only like 10 roles for 1,000 people, there's a good chance that that's not going to go to an individual that comes from a minority background of some sort. So that's at least my 2 cents, maybe probably more than 2 cents. But if you have thoughts, feel free to add it to the comments. I'd love to hear what people agree with me on, what they disagree with me on. I think I'm certainly interested in having more debates on this and more conversations about this. I am pro having more inclusion and more diversity and equity in a company and in the people I work with. I just find a lot of these efforts to be half-hearted, and sometimes the few conversations you have about it are not particularly constructive, and I think it's a shame.
Still, less than half of U.S. corporate employees say their executive teams reflect the diversity of their employees in 2024. One of the problems with diversity initiatives is getting shareholders on board, especially when it is hard to translate to dollars.
Everything doesn't have to be quantitative. So we live in a society where if you can't count it, if you can't quantify it, then it doesn't matter.
And these are some of the sample metrics around the power of inclusion and inclusive workplaces. You've got over 70% more likelihood to generate revenue from innovation revenue, which is new products and services revenue. You have 70% more likelihood to capture new markets. You have a higher level of team performance. You have a higher level of collaboration. And importantly, given how critical talent is today, you have a much lower risk of attrition.
In recent years, DEI efforts have seen an uptick in pushback, and more than 100 bills have been introduced in 30 states aimed at restricting these initiatives. And some executives are increasingly wary of taking public stances on social issues, which could cause legal risks to businesses. 9 in 10 executives believe taking a public stance on a social issue is riskier than staying silent, according to one study.
It's a broader swath of Americans who are just sick of all the divisive woke stuff. They just want to be able to exist in the marketplace.
Recently, several major publicly traded companies and household names, including Tractor Supply, John Deere, Harley-Davidson, Ford, and Lowe's, scaled back their DEI policies.
Yeah, as that individual mentioned, though completely unrelated to this topic, having a last name of Starbuck just feels fake. I don't think I've ever met anyone like that. But apologies to that individual if that's your actual real name. It just seems like a very fake last name, but I digress. Going back to the DEI segment, again, this is where I think they did have a reasonable point, which is like some of these conversations get pretty divisive. As I had just mentioned, even in some of these conversations, sometimes I'm completely shut down in my opinion on how some of these things should be enacted or what we should be aiming for, based off of what people perceive of me right off the bat. And I've had many conversations where I'm completely ignored of my opinion until basically I share my background and what race I am. And then suddenly people start listening, even though it's the same opinion before and after. And I think that's a shame. And I think that kind of highlights sort of some of the sort of inherent aggression that comes up in some of these. And I think there's certainly some people who are held back in certain scenarios like this. And I do think that makes it more powerful, as they previously mentioned, when you do include somebody or do support somebody who is from a minority background or isn't like everybody else that's around you. Because what better way of showing that you care about an individual than saying, I believe in your work, I think you do good work, and that you are excelling regardless of what you look like or what you believe in. Especially in a scenario where most of the time you could be discriminated against or potentially not get as many opportunities for. And that really means a lot. And I think that's certainly shouldn't be underestimated. In reverse, I've also seen a lot of opposition to these things of when you push for inclusion or diversity purely for the sake of inclusion or diversity, this can also lead to some negativity from the other employees when that person isn't as qualified as somebody else. And so I'm not going to say that that is the case in every scenario, but it could happen. And I think this is where, for some companies, if you are pushing so hard on let's just hire whoever is of a particular demographic, and that's the most important thing to you, that can also really send an odd signal and can be taken poorly by other employees of that company. And I'm sure that would happen for a variety of reasons. Like if you are Asian, for instance, and your company has a good amount of Asian people there, and you see that somebody who's Latino gets a position that you don't think they're qualified for, you're going to be mad. So I don't think it has to be specific to your race or gender. I think this is going to be true if you see somebody else get opportunities that you don't perceive are well-deserved. And I think that this is something that always enters these discussions, whether or not, or at least it enters the minds of people, whether or not they're actually talking about it, is that if you question that person's abilities and you see them as a person who's representing a particular group, that can really sour these initiatives for you. And I think that's one of the things that I've seen is that the combination of half-heartedness plus some of things backfiring with people kind of seeing these initiatives being taken too far, or some spokesperson for this kind of being too aggressive in a variety of ways can kind of undermine the message that you're having. And so this is where, at least my personal belief is, you should try to ensure that you're fair in how you're measuring people's competency. And obviously you have to go beyond that in many cases to actually make your companies diverse. Obviously that's not the only criteria. You can just look at white men in their resumes and then just check which white man is hitting the bar that you set out. Obviously you also have to look into trying to bring in people from diverse backgrounds and try to make sure that you're at least soliciting individuals from those backgrounds to be assessed fairly. And so I think that's where, really in my mind, the best thing that you can do is, if you're from a minority group, if you can show that you got there on your own, in my opinion, and that you can do it better than everyone else can, which is probably likely and necessary for you to do in order to be successful in your role, especially if you're a minority member, from what leadership looks like, then people are probably going to respect you and the group you represent more than they would have if they're unsure of whether or not you got the job through some initiative or whether you got it on your own merits. And I think some of these projects have so many ways where they can backfire just because this is such a complex topic and issue. So it is interesting to see, but I do hope that this leads to more evolution in how we think about DEI, and at least it being part of the discussion now means that maybe in the next iteration, people can be more mindful of it and maybe find better ways of compromising in these areas and lead to equity that's more longstanding.
We looked down that list of most trusted brands by conservatives in America, we realized they all had these policies, and they were all opposed to the fundamental values and tenets and beliefs of conservative consumers.
Robbie Starbuck has over 1 million followers across his social media platforms and has been able to galvanize conservative consumers.
So there's a real financial incentive for companies to look and take very seriously what we're saying and pull back where it's appropriate to pull back.
More people now have permission to be, quote, anti-DEI. And I think that for those organizations, they probably were already only doing it because they felt it was the socially acceptable thing to do. So they really weren't doing it because they saw this as a critical aspect of their business success.
U.S. companies spend an average of $8 billion a year on DEI. Training can be costly, ranging from a couple $1,000s to well over $1 million, depending on company size.
The DEI departments at large have cost quite a bit of money and have borne very little fruit.
The budgets are definitely being cut. We do find that in this era where there's so much backlash, we do find that organizations' budgets, have been cut.
Although business leaders are supporters of DEI initiatives, shareholders and board members are far less likely to prioritize it.
The board has a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. These boards are understanding that when we reach out to their company, that there is proof already in the marketplace that we move the markets. And I don't want to destroy any businesses. I want to help restore the heart and soul of corporate America, which is the idea that the consumer is king.
One study found that while only 20% of U.S. companies plan to cut or eliminate DEI initiatives in 2024, the landscape is complex. Many organizations continue to view it as essential for business success.
There are many, many organizations who are still doing diversity, equity, inclusion, and who have come out and said, this is not optional for us because we know that it is a business imperative. This work goes in waves, right? And so there's the time when things are kind of quiet and you can just work the system and get things through. Nobody's really talking about it to the extent that we are now.
DEI pullback is a bit overstated, as organizations are largely doubling down on commitment, but risks are apparent, particularly to organizations who take public stances on social issues.
I think there's no question that the future is going to be won by companies that choose neutrality on divisive political and social issues. There's no reason that we need to know the social position of a diaper company.
Our values of liberty and justice for all, our values of equality, should take us there because we want to create a world that works for all. The better off I am, the better off other people are.
Well, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, please please hit like or subscribe. I will see you around.